Wurt's skill tree is something that's been somewhat controversial when it comes to the community reception to it, with particular emphasis leaning towards being negative. There are a couple reasons as to why this might be, but we can analyze that once we go over the skills found in her skill tree themselves, starting off with the Amphibian line of skills. These primarily focus on buffing Wurt when she's wet, with the first two providing sanity regen over time, and not by an insignificant amount either, being able to bypass the sanity drain from dusk and night with just a bit of wetness and a top hat. The next perk in this line is one that simply alleviates the temperature downside with wetness, causing Wurt to become less cold as a result of it. Finally are the health related benefits relating to wetness, with one branch offering the ability to regen HP over time while you're wet, and the other providing a sort of health increase, as with this skill, wetness effectively becomes your health. Next up is everything revolving around Merms and the swamp. This branch starts with the ability to craft what is effectively mosquito repellent in the form of Lil Itchy. Following that is the ability to craft mosquito related items, including a healing option that is specific to Merms, a new type of fertilizer, and all kind of relating to mosquito sacks, or mosquitoes in some way. And finally is the ability to snatch up mosquitoes without the need of a bug net, as well as unlocking a bit more crafts, with the most notable one being the mosquito bomb. Next up are mostly all the Merm King buffs, with the first column being dedicated to unlocking a new sort of questline for upgrading Merms, with each skill being the ability to give Merm King either a marble suit for defense buffs, Thulecite crown for additional beneficial AI, and lastly is Strident Trident for just increase in damage. And lastly in the final column are Merm King hunger buffs, which just allow you to feed him less often. These aren't the only skills in this segment, however, as there are two more rows and two more isolated skills. The first two rows / 3 columns are structures which are meant to serve to give better functionality to Merms. The communal kelp dish allows you to increase the rate at which Merms will respawn after death, and the second tier does mostly the same thing, but with the added benefit of being able to call Merms to hire them if there is kelp in the dish itself. The last two columns and parts of the row are pretty similar, as both are structures which provide buffs to Merms, with the first one providing a place for Merms to get their own tools, allowing them to chop and mine more efficiently, as well as just digging up stumps and till fields. The next one provides helmets to warrior Merms, just simply giving them more armor during fights. And as for the two isolated skills, these are mostly random, with the first one causing Merms to behave similarly to bunnymen, which causes them to run away when they're at low health until they either regen the HP themselves, or are healed by other means. The second one focuses primarily on other players in that you can increase the movement speeds of other nearby players while you're standing on marsh turf, which is pretty useful in certain scenarios. Finally is the Wurt alignment branch, which is primarily used to influence Merms and orient them in one of two ways, that being the shadow and the lunar side. The requirement for both of these are unique, with the shadow simply being done once Merms die, which between you and me after the update is easier said than done. But once they do die, they do spawn shadow Merms in their place, serving as what is essentially just an extra life. On the flip side are the lunar Merms, which, if I remember correctly, are strictly better than the shadow Merms in regards to their total health and damage output, but are more expensive in regards to their cost, requiring mood shards to transform each individual one. Both of these can be buffed with Pure Horror and Pure Brilliance respectively, with each temporarily increasing the damage output of the two. Their second affinity perks are similar to one another as well, with both allowing Wurt to craft a staff to temporarily place down a small patch of swamp turf, which doubles as an arena and turns Merms into their shadow / lunar counterparts when within the casting area. All of these are pretty good, with each skill either boosting the utility of Merms to an even further level, if not the perks just outright introducing mechanics that boost Wurt's day-to-day survival, if even by just a little bit. As I was looking into the feedback on this, by the way, I did find that there's quite a bit of negative feedback when it was in beta from the community. Now, from what I gathered, this kind of negative feedback was primarily due to the skill tree being decent, but not the greatest in regards to how much it improves the character. And I mean, I guess? Sure? Like, obviously I'm a bit pessimistic about this whole update since the Winona part, which is the part I really cared about, just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, but I just don't really see this as a big deal personally. Like, the biggest complaint that I'd have and that I've seen other people have that is specific in regards to what it points to on the skill tree is that this update is kind of one note and simultaneously pretty lacking in the large gameplay change to Wurt, with this primarily just opting towards giving her buffs to her already established Merm-based structures. But here's the thing, and this kind of goes into a big theme that I've wanted to talk about in regards to skill trees in general. Wurt didn't really need too much done with her skill tree. Like, here's the thing. When it comes to these skill trees, while everyone is getting one, some characters need differing approaches to them in order for the skill trees to feel like they are both somewhat fair and also still important to the character. You know, if we look at 3 different characters, you know, let's say Willow, Woody, and Wolfgang, these characters all have different issues prior to them getting skill trees that the new updates have sort of remedied in some way. Willow had the issue of lacking an identity that was in line with how she was advertised, that being as the fire starter. And that was the biggest complaint that I've seen from Willow mains during the time prior to her getting that skill tree, which of course, you know, was remedied by it. This was done simply by giving her what are essentially wizard powers, which, love them or hate them, I think they did a lot in order to improve the character and make her feel more in line with just having control over fire. You know, Wolfgang's was a character who was very lackluster in regards to the skill tree that he received, with a lot of people kind of being bummed out about it, which is understandable, but at the same time, this only being a number buff is something that is kind of justifiable, because Wolfgang as a character already had tons going for him and had a lot of features that made him feel impactful to play and continue playing as. Really, the only thing that might have needed fixing was just to future-proof Wolfgang's perks of not having proper scaling with planar damage. Which was remedied as a result of his skill tree. So ultimately, this skill tree really just felt like the most tame way to do a mandatory buff for a character that didn't really need one. Now lastly is Woody. This is kind of an interesting case because this felt more like a way to buff the character in the fields that he was lacking in, but not by necessarily introducing new mechanics or items or anything like that. They ultimately just made him feel more rewarding, as well as making his existing perks feel like less of a hindrance. You know, this was done by simply buffing the different forms, including but not limited to adding utility to the Werebeaver, you know, granting it the tail slam which insta down trees nearby, increasing the benefits of Weregoose, such as an increased movement speed, which are really nice, and lastly to buff the Weremoose form by giving him increased damage and health regen, which went a long way for making it feel like it was worth it for the character. And lastly, let's not forget that they fixed full moons forever being not an option for Woody, with his lunar affinity, which is probably the most requested thing for him to receive at the time. So seeing that they actually implemented it into his skill tree as a solution is really nice. Now going back to the Wurt skill tree though, I think Wurt is very much in the same camp as Wolfgang, in that Wurt was already an incredibly strong character, so giving her what essentially amounts to just number buffs is fine. Like, Wurt has tons of perks and skills going for her, even without the implementation of the skill tree, and it's for that reason that I think this update is fine in its approach. I do understand the complaints that people might have about the skill tree though, like the irony of me complaining about Winona's skill tree for not really adding anything new to the character, and saying that the Wurt skill tree is fine while being what are essentially just number buffs, which are the big thing that I complain about. Like, that's not something that's lost on me. But I think the way that Clay went about implementing these number buffs to a character who I would say doesn't really need that much else is really interesting and does tons to make this character feel like they have even more of a game plan going forward. It's just so good. You know, I'm a big fan of the character and the skill tree, and it just really goes a long way to help me enjoy her even more than I usually would. So breaking down the skill tree even further, I think that the wetness perks are really interesting in that wetness as a stat is something that most people tend to just ignore until it's an apparent problem. Until it's spring and you have to deal with rain all the time, nobody really cared about it. And even then, most people would just put on their umbrella and just outright ignore it. Like, this skill tree just really does a lot to make wetness something that Wurt wants to manage, which I personally really like. While I do think that people are blowing how bad the mosquito skill tree is out of the water, I don't think that it's the greatest. The mosquito line's got a couple things going for it. I like the ability to just increase the amount of healing done by mosquito sacks in the form of the Merm only stinger, and the fertilizer isn't really bad in regards to the nutrient values and its cost. And last but certainly not least is the mosquito bomb, which just deals 59 damage on a pretty cheap ranged weapon, with the added benefit of granting followers that will passively deal damage to enemies, even though they do pop after a while, just after stinging something an amount of times. You know, it's really solid in regards to a ranged weapon that you can mass produce. Like, it's not something that you're gonna make 20 of, but it's something that is not terrible to have on you in case you need to quickly deal with like hounds or something like that. Though that is to say, you do have to manage with the noise, and that is enough of a downside in and of itself to warrant me understanding if people don't want to run it. You know, I get it. Now, that being said, I am kind of looking forward to the ability to just grab mosquitoes come the Halloween event, since being able to make the budget jelly bean items has always been something that never really felt worth it because it would require bug net charges in order to catch those live mosquitoes that are required in it. But you know, now if you could just snatch them up out of the air, all of a sudden that becomes a much better option. The different quests that buff Merms are really nice, in my opinion, since just being able to buff all Merms in ways like increasing their defense, their smarter AI patterns, and increasing their damage output is all super nice. And the way to go about it is an interesting way to implement number buffs to a character. Now it makes it feel like you're actually going out and involving yourself in order to get these number buffs, rather than just clicking a button to apply them. The hunger timer is fine as a quality of life thing. You know, it's not something that's particularly necessary, all things considered, since Merm King already lasts quite a bit. But still, you know, as is the trend, it's just nice to have. The loose too, in regards to the skill tree that cause Merms to back off and allies to be faster on Swamp Turf, are kind of whatever, if I'm being honest. You know, their uses are kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. With, like, at best, I could see them being something nice for you and your team, and at worst, it's just, like, a waste of a skill point. Like, I understand the idea of it. Being able to place down an arena is really nice, and having your allies get benefits from it is also pretty good, but I feel like at that point, you're probably just better off making cobblestone and using that instead. The final 6 before the affinity perks are kind of where I question the choices. So I don't understand why they have upgradable versions, since it just feels like it makes the previous ones just completely irrelevant, which kind of just sucks in my opinion. I mean, ultimately, I don't think it's a huge deal. I would have, however, liked for the ability to just upgrade the existing structures, rather than having to craft entirely new ones. As for the effects of these things, they're so good. Worker Merms being able to dig up stumps, that's huge. Warrior Merms being able to significantly become more tanky, also huge. Being able to just auto-hire tons of Merms with the communal kelp dish, so good. Like, all of these are just incredibly good and double down on what makes Merms as good as they are, and makes them more convenient to manage. And lastly is the affinity perks. I actually do really like them. Along with simply being buffs to the Merms in whichever path you choose to orient yourself, they also double in solving the issue of power creep, which I can appreciate, since adding planar damage to things just seems to be the direction where the game needs to go in order to keep up with dealing with all these threats. Overall, this skill tree really does feel like the best thing we could reasonably ask for in regards to Wurt, and the approaches to solving any potential issues that may happen in the future is a very cool and interesting approach. You know, I'm a fan, is the TLDR. You know, I'm a big fan of the skill tree. I think it's pretty solid in what it provides the character, but, you know, that's all I really have to say about it. I understand the points of, like, you know, people don't like that you could just swap off of Wurt once you build the structures. I think that's reasonable. I think that's a fair complaint. You know, I think that having all of these points being allocated to just number buffs, while I do understand why that is the approach that Clay took, simultaneously is something that I definitely understand people getting upset about and complaining about. But I think it does a lot for the character. I just think that the skill tree is really well implemented. I think it does a lot for Wurt. But let me know what you guys think about it. You know, are you guys in the camp that, like, doesn't like the skill tree? Do you guys like the skill tree? You know, what's the deal? I don't say it enough, but, you know, if you guys made it this far into the video, I would really appreciate it if you guys would subscribe. It means a lot to me. You know, it makes me feel good. It makes me want to, you know, just put out more content. all that fun stuff. I really appreciate the feedback, and that's all I really got to talk about. So I'm gonna, get started on that Winona guide where I talk about some revolutionary new tech and, simultaneously be sad about the update. But, until next time, bye-bye.